Oh, it's 10 o'clock now, Rick. It is. Are you ready to go? 3, 2, 1. Welcome. What am I welcoming you to? I'll go tell them, Cassidy, what we're welcoming them to.
All right. Well, welcome to another edition of Randomizing Randos. It's sort of a little panel discussion scenario that we're trying out on the Discord. I'm Cassidy. I'm going to be hosting this today. Basically, how it works is people from the community suggest topics of conversation that they want to talk with Paul, and then we pick them, and people volunteer to be randomly selected to participate. So today we're talking about Charismatic Christianity, which was submitted by Nick Freewheelin. I think I'm saying that right, maybe not. Freewheelin. And then he's going to be on the panel today along with our randomly selected participants, Sarah and Nate Heil. So to start, I'm going to have all of the participants from the randos give a brief introduction, starting with Nate and then to Sarah, finishing off with Nick. And then we'll let Nick kind of explain his prompt and kind of give clarity of where he wants to go with the conversation. Does that all sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Right. So the first hour and a half will just be the four of them talking. And then for the last half an hour, it can be open to the rest of the Discord to add any comments or questions that you have. So with that, let's get started. Nate, do you want to give a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. I'm Nate Heil. I suppose I should probably say how I connect to this topic. My religious upbringing was Pentecostal. In my childhood, I was agnostic by 12. For whatever other virtues Pentecostalism might have, robust theology and the ability to answer questions is not one of them. I still feel some sort of connection to the faith of my childhood, particularly because of my mother. So I'm interested in the topic.
Awesome. Thanks. Sarah, did you want to go?
I would love to. My name is Sarah, and I have a very interesting background as far as this stuff goes. I was involved in mostly dysfunctional versions of the Charismatic Church, and a lot of damage was done to my relationship with the church through it. So I think I've been able to find my way back to some of it actually through Orthodoxy and Catholicism. But I'm still at the point where I'm trying to figure out how it integrates in the best way, and have come back to appreciate a lot of it. But I'm excited about this topic because I don't want to throw it out, which I did for a season in my life. But yeah, I guess that's about it for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. All right. And finally, Nick, go for it.
Yeah, so I was raised in a charismatic church. Those terms could be dissected, but for now I think Pentecostal, charismatic can be used interchangeably for the sake of brevity here. But yeah, I was raised in that church. It was just normal Christianity as far as I was concerned. And so I kind of went away from that in my late teens, and then when I was 18, came back in, and that was pretty dysfunctional. My pre-adult life in it, and then my post-adult life, really right at the 18 mark, I began seeking out God again, and I went to conferences. I went to meetings, went to revivals, all that sort of stuff, and I went to school at Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry up here in Reading. I did that for 2 years, and it was after that I really came to grips with the meaning crisis that I had personally been in for a long time. And I found that, similar to what Nate had said, it didn't really have the answers it didn't really have answers, not just for like intellectual questions like, hey, this doesn't make sense, but meaning crisis questions, which takes us into the prompt. You can read the prompt if you want. It's in Question Ranking Randos, but just to sort of share the spirit behind it, the charismatics have gotten brought up a lot of different times. Paul references it a lot. I've heard Pajot reference it. I've heard Tom Holland reference it. In his first interview with Paul, he said there's this very intriguing charismatic church down the road, and he can't catch the spirit, but he's intrigued by it. In his latest interview with Pajot, he said that Western Christians became embarrassed by supernaturalism and modernity. But all the while, really ever since probably the First Great Awakening in America, you had a large sect of Christianity not following that modernity, no supernatural thing at all. In fact, they were sort of rebelling against it and having these revivals and these moves of the Spirit, these healings, miracles, all this sort of stuff. So really my prompt was brought about because of this, because I want to, my goal isn't to just trash it and say how wrong it is. My goal would be for people outside of it to pay attention to it and to what it's saying and how it fits in with the meaning crisis, because it's not just a simple Christians rejected the supernatural for the past 300 years, because you had a vast sect who was not doing that. And then also anyone within it to take critiques and build up your tribe even more. So that is sort of my heart behind it, to figure out how it fits in with this thing, this project that we're all engaging in this Discord, surrounding the meaning crisis and all this. So I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, Nick, I really related to everything you said there. In fact, one of the things that brought me back to like a connection with my charismatic upbringing is just finding like things that were shockingly similar to the things that my mother taught me when I was growing up, like in scholars that I respected who took it seriously.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'll hear Pajot talk about something. Like one of the first interviews I heard from Pajot, he talked about the life of Moses and how life-changing that was for him. And I read the life of Moses, and I was like, I've heard about 5 sermons like this. Now, I'm not saying they're at the same caliber of St. Gregory of Nyssa, but that whole viewing the story of Moses through this symbolic lens of your journey with God, I'm like, this actually isn't that far apart. So I don't know if that ties in with what you were saying, Nate, but I've noticed things like that as well.
Well, 100%. I think the first moment that it really struck me is when I was reading David Bentley Hart's Doors of the Sea, and he was talking quite seriously and taking quite seriously the language about principalities and powers, and taking the spiritual realm very seriously. And I couldn't help it. Like it struck me that here's this scholar that I respect, who's, to me, from my perspective, it seemed like he was channeling my mother.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in many ways, it's not that far. It's not that far off. It takes a slight little adjustment to cross over.
Maybe we can back up a little bit and have you guys answer or just tell a little bit more of your stories about what in the Pentecostal tradition soured you and why.
Should I go first?
Sure.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Okay. Well, growing up from about, as early as I can remember until I was probably 13 or so, we were involved in a Reformed Baptist type church. It was very, I would say, hyper Calvinistic, all double predestination. If your baby dies and, there's no hope for your miscarried child to go to heaven, things like that were taught from the pulpit. So it just came to the point where it felt very dead for my parents, and they started getting involved in a small group that was very excited about the movement of the Spirit and these traveling prophets that were coming through and having all of these meetings, and it's a very revival type atmosphere. And so at about 13 or 14, we ended up leaving that Reformed Baptist type church, which was actually non-denominational, but that's the best I can describe it, and ended up in a very charismatic church that was along the lines of Word of Faith. So very into Kenneth Copeland, Jesse Duplantis. If you know these names, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it was very focused on outward manifestations. So a lot of falling over, a lot of strange noises, emphasis on speaking in tongues as manifestation of your second baptism in the Spirit. And it was emphasized that if that didn't happen, I mean, you were still a Christian, but not fully. And I remember even as a 12, 13-year-old, and I was very involved in the music at this time. Even by 14, I was leading worship at our church, and we would have, 1, 2, 3 hour long worship services. And I was involved in that, and I can't say that I didn't have moments where I felt connection with God through it. I did. But I was always very skeptical of what I saw because it seemed so easy to just put on. And when I was almost forced in one instance to speak in tongues, and I didn't do it, there was a lot of shame that went along with that. And I just never felt like I could get there, nor did I really want to. It just was this check in my, in my spirit or whatnot that prevented it. But I also, as a kid, felt very connected to the spiritual realm, was very aware of principalities and those things around me. Had even experienced some things like when I was young, I was pretty rebellious and went through a phase where I was lying a lot to my mom, and ended up having a dream where I was standing on a chair and there were rats, these big hairy black rats, climbing up the chair trying to chew on my legs. And I woke up from that dream terrified. And I went and found my mom's dream book, because obviously you have to have a dream interpretation book in your house if you grow up in this type of environment, and looked up what rats meant. And it says in this book that rats represented lies and deceit. And so that's just one experience of that. And I've had other experiences where I hesitate to call them prophetic, but I guess that's the only thing you could label them with. But then going back to my church experience, with it being more of a Word of Faith, prosperity gospel type church, it was very emphasized on giving in order to receive. The pastor and his wife, the church would go together and get him, a huge diamond ring. They had a nice car. These traveling prophets would come through, and a couple of times, one of them, it ended up being really uncomfortable because he would almost single out young, attractive women and almost flirt with them during the prophetic meeting. And it happened to me a couple of times. And then another one that traveled through, and they would attract these huge crowds, and it almost felt like fortune telling. Like people would come it was like a show. And then this other traveling prophet ended up, it came out that he was having a homosexual affair with his son-in-law, and just really awful things like that. So all of that to say that's kind of my first negative experience. I had a second one, but I can save that for later.
Well, that's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
So Nate, you talked about you were agnostic by 12. What happened to you?
Yeah. I've always had an intellectual bent in my personality, and been very inquisitive. And I took the problem of evil very seriously at a very young age. The sort of answers I got to my almost that was really the focus. Like I wasn't like, I was never an atheist at any point. I think like the closest I ever got to being an atheist was like that maybe it's a 50-50 shot whether there's a God or not. I was never, so never at any point was I an atheist. And but I did have serious questions about what these things meant, and I just didn't find any good answers. I definitely, like, in terms of like, I had, and then the other thing tied to that, the other thing that really like turned me off in particular to the Pentecostal faith I was raised in, was that the emphasis on speaking in tongues was so over the top that essentially your status as a believer would be questioned if you didn't do it. So there was this massive pressure to do it, and I never felt comfortable doing it. And that caused me all kinds of problems because I'm a person who definitely suffers from an excess of gravitas. That is like not healthy for me as a person. I take myself way too seriously. So I would torture myself as like, is it just my pride that's keeping me from doing this? Do I just not want to appear foolish in public? Or do I just genuinely not feel moved by the Spirit? So it was like a constant state of like doubt and torment, both along theological lines and just like questioning my own faith. And eventually it just got to be entirely overwhelming, and I just like rejected it entirely and started seeking answers elsewhere. After my state of agnosticism lasted from that time in my late childhood until my early 20s. And well, actually, no, a little bit younger than that. I think I was 19 actually. And I was at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. And we had a field trip to a Russian Orthodox church in a rural part of Washington State that was about 45 minutes away from Olympia. And that experience shook me from being an agnostic who thought it was a 50-50 chance, an agnostic who thought there probably was a God, but didn't believe that there was any possibility of certainty in anything. But it was a very profound experience for me. Subsequently, I transferred to Thomas Aquinas College, which is a very conservative Catholic university in Southern California, in Santa Paula. And I found a lot of really good answers to a lot of the questions that I had growing up that were to be found from the people I was interacting with at Thomas Aquinas. And that kind of put me on a path toward, within a few years after leaving Thomas Aquinas, I did convert to Catholicism. But there was something, like, for me, there was always something lacking in Catholicism for me from just like a personal, like emotional standpoint. Like I didn't connect with the faith. And eventually I ended up like becoming or returning to a Pentecostal church that was pastored by one of my best friend's fathers from when I was growing up, who was he was a Pentecostal that had an unusually atypical, very intellectual bent, and I found his church tolerable. I ended up moving and just kind of falling away for a long time and kind of like falling in and out of agnosticism until I discovered Jordan Peterson, quite frankly, and that kind of like put a new light on things. But the thing that really put me over the top in terms of moving specifically toward Christianity was David Bentley Hart. So that's kind of my whole arc.
That's very interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Nick? Because Nick doesn't live too far from Sacramento, so we did make it down to a meetup. So I've heard some of his story, but why don't you get into yours a little bit, Nick?
Okay, yeah, I was raised in a charismatic church. I went with my mom and my grandparents and went to a little private school connected to the church. And, my categories used to be spirit-filled and not spirit-filled as far as Christians go, and God and not God. So miracles, supernatural experiences, healings, those were all signs that God was present, and it was a stamp of approval on the person or the movement of the church. That's just kind of how it was in my mind. There were things that didn't add up for me as a kid, but again, it's like for whatever reason, and this was in the more negative experience I had with charismatic Christianity. It's like I couldn't question it, because all that stuff that was happening was proof that God was on it. And I don't even remember specific times where someone was tyrannizing me, like those unfortunate those unfortunate events that Sarah described. I never had anything directly like that, but it was more of like I was picking up on the atmosphere around me, and like, God's here. So I mean, what is there to ask? Like, he's just here. And so that gets very suffocating very quickly. And so you have nowhere to go except for out, which is what I did. But I quickly found that out in the world wasn't doing it for me either, because I was terribly broken. And so I came back to Christianity, or I came back to God truly with a contrite heart at that point when I was 18. And, I'm very thankful for my time after that, because I was in a very functional, albeit not perfect, charismatic environment that ultimately led me out to Bethel. And Bethel, for all its faults, which we may or may not get into during the recording or after the recording, is very integrous. Like, there's no shady business going on there. Like, I've been in the belly of the beast, not to use such a harsh term, but I've been in the very middle of it, and they're very integrous and honest. I think misguided in some areas, but my breakdown, not my breakdown, but my meaning crisis sort of happened because the reason I had gone to Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, at least the second time. The first time I was just, young and excited and like anything can happen and this is going to be great. And then I had a bit of buyer's remorse at the end because it didn't happen. Like, I didn't experience the transformation I had hoped or have the experiences I had hoped. And really, the last couple of years where I was kind of all in, the best thing I can compare it to is like I was sitting beside the pool of Bethesda waiting for the angel to stir the water. And it just wasn't happening. And so I sort of deconstructed, and I didn't know what was true. I didn't know what was real. But I never could throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I never could say that, these stories I would hear, like one of the teachers at Bethel, he would share the story of when he was young and he was a mechanic he had his own auto repair place, and he was praying and reading his Bible, and then he says he had this vision where God came into the bathroom and said, "You're going to be a prophet to the nations." And God turned away, and then God turned back and said, "And time will tell if you actually believe me," or something like that. I don't doubt that story, as crazy as that is. I can't stay in the movement in the church, but I don't doubt that happened to him. I think we would disagree on what it means or his teaching. But so just to give an example of kind of where I'm at, I've never been I'm just going to throw it all out now. It's just never been in my personality. I have different categories. It's no longer just spirit-filled, not spirit-filled, God, not God. It's no longer, this healing happened. That's the same of when Jesus healed the person. Because one of my gripes with the charismatic movement when it comes to miracles is it's sort of rebelling against modernity, saying, how dare you say we can't have miracles, because they're everywhere. Like, I'm sorry, they are, you know what I mean? But then it puts them inside of modernist categories, and puts those miracles in the same category as the biblical miracles, which I'm not saying they all aren't, but there's something preeminent and super to me about Christ's miracles and in like lives of the saints, the miracles of the saints. So I'm getting into a lot of different things right now, but I'm getting into like, Protestantism and all that stuff. But what brought me back, not to the Charismatic Church, but what really helped me to stay a Christian was rediscovering the meaning behind all these things. So for instance, like Jordan Peterson, who wasn't even sure if he believed what I believed, would infuse them with meaning. He's like, this is what it's saying. And I'm like, you don't even believe it, but you know what it's saying. I didn't know what it was saying. I just forced myself to believe it. And so it's kind of like that with miracles. It's like everything Christ does, all his miracles are infused with meaning. But I think a lot of times we lose the meaning in the Charismatic Church and we just go, oh, this cool stuff's happening, this prophetic word, and it's about the thing itself instead of it being sort of an icon to God's kingdom or to greater things. And so that's for me kind of what helped me stabilize was, oh, I understand the deep down here at my lowest point. I understand the meaning of the gospel, which is that Christ showed that death leads to glory. And so I can see all the darkness around me. And even if I see it transform my lifetime or not, I know it will because of the cross. Dostoevsky, like I think we've all encountered things like that. So I'm kind of veering off course now, but that is sort of my story. That's my story.
So one of the things I hear in all of your stories, and I'd be really curious to hear what each of you heard in the other's stories and what really sort of lit up for you and was salient to you. But one of the things that is clear is there's sort of a fetishization of the miraculous in some of these movements, that the presence of the miraculous itself is a validation of the individuals, a validation of the institutions. And once the individual and institution is validated in this way, then, at least in Sarah and Nate's, especially in Sarah's story, then sort of anything goes. And so you'll have the dissonance of both the validation and then, the community, the communal validation around the miraculous. And then you see other things that are happening that feel clearly abusive, clearly discordant with Christianity. So that's certainly an area in this. And Nick and I have talked about this before. A lot of my take on this is that the charismatic and Pentecostal movements are in some ways, full-throated denials of modernity. And I was actually thinking about this quite a bit last night, about how the other traditions have long had elements of the miraculous. The Roman Catholic Church, to be canonized as a saint, there needs to be sort of a credible, validated miracle attributed to that individual. You have the various appearances of Mary around the world, usually accompanied by healings or other, for lack of a better term, supernatural manifestations. Some of this. So, I see that running through all of your stories. What did you notice in each other's stories?
The thing that stood out to me was that, like, how much sincere attempt there was to engage with it. Like, it seems like we all seem to, at least at some point, have wanted whatever it was, and when that didn't come, then it threw us into doubt. And I think that's the real danger in these sort of movements, is that they put so much emphasis on it that when things don't happen, it's like it throws people into this cycle of of doubt.
That's a really interesting observation, given the fact that when Jesus is on the cross, all of the Gospels recognize that the main vector of taunting and mockery against him was the lack of miraculous deliverance. And that issue continues to be an insistence, at least within Islam, that, well, of course, something, that could not have been the Son of God or a great prophet on the cross, because God would never have allowed something that tragic to happen to his chosen one. So go ahead, Sarah. I think I jumped on you.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just going to add that I mean, you said that Pentecostalism or the charismatic movement is a rejection of modernity, but at the same time, I've seen it I've seen people try and approach it in a very literalistic, modern way with the Bible, in the same way that you would take it and figure out, okay, we're going to find this exact formula for how to make healing work like it should work. And so I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but that's how I felt about it. It's like, we're going to take the Bible sola scriptura and we're going to figure out exactly what it means by speaking in tongues without any reference to history or tradition or anything like that.
I think that's a absolutely exactly right. That and this is throughout the modernist fundamentalist fights, and so often in the midst of church wars, that both sides have simply in some ways already been overwhelmed by the change, and that there are some strange inconsistencies. And so I think you're exactly right. It's the from what I've seen from some groups, they've taken the supernatural and tried to turn it into into technology. And so some of the books that I've read from certain groups, well, here is exactly how to perform a miracle. And what they do in the midst of it is depersonalize God and his agency and his freedom, and simply turn it into another form of technology. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and a couple things I'll add to tie in what's been said is that goes along with the lines of fundamentalism, as well as charismatic Christianity, that goes with what Nate said, where there's such a heavy emphasis, and then when it's not there, it can only lead to doubt or to a meaning crisis. So one of the things for me is, because I grew up just as much fundamentalist as I did charismatic, rejecting evolution, even as a process, was tantamount to my faith. And so when I began to question that and to wonder, or even to hear Peterson at first, who would just, talk about evolution as if the sun came up this morning, was crap. Like, my entire life, my entire being is at stake, because if this is true, I'm just a speck of dust. And so, strangely enough, it was Peterson who helped me overcome that, because he showed the meaning behind it. But in many ways, Peterson's not an honest evolutionary, because they all have to assume imago Dei, or their arguments fall apart. But anyway, that's just an example of what Nate was talking about, where it's like that specific issue. I mean, I wrestled with that for years, because it's like my entire livelihood was at stake. And then to what Sarah was saying, absolutely. Like, this is something, Paul, you and I got into one time in the Q&A. We were talking about is that charismatics are the other side of the coin, these hardcore modernists. But in being anti-modernist, they're trying to fit everything into modern category, into like scientific equations categories. So it's like, in the same way that Protestantism largely is like, say these words, believe in your heart, boom, you're saved. Charismatics do that with all sorts of stuff. They do it with healing. They do it with prophecy. They do it with word of knowledge. I've seen and heard crazy things that don't fit. But I think one of the problems with the spiritual, and Paul even said this, is that as soon as you try to fit it into non-spiritual categories, you're done. Like, you lose it. It's like putting a lightning bug in a jar. It's going to stop flashing light because you're going to kill it. So to echo what Sarah was saying, like, I agree. In large part, it's anti-modernist in its appearances, but it's largely subverted to modernism in its categories and in its mechanisms.
One of the interesting things that's coming out here is the relationship between at least our contemporary category of the miraculous and the symbolic. Well, at least, with well, all of you, I mean, sort of how we all found each other was sort of through Jordan Peterson and some of that. David Bentley Hart has come in here. What and Sarah's been migrating over to Orthodoxy. Nate, wound up at Thomas Aquinas College. What do you think is the connection between our contemporary category of the miraculous and then the symbolic, as you found in some of these sacramental traditions, liturgical traditions, and the symbolism that you see, say, work through Jonathan Peugeot?
Well, I would say it's the sacrament, right? Like, that's like that. That is like sacramental churches, like, validate the miraculous, right? I mean, in the sacrament, like, and I think that's where the root of it is in the sacrament itself.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I think part of what has seemed off for me in the charismatic movements that I've been a part of, and I'm just speaking from the ones that I have direct connection with, and mine happen to have been pretty dysfunctional. So I know that not everyone has had that experience. So I want to say, I think a couple people have said in the comments that, is this all negative? I know, again, I know people that are involved in these churches that are full of life and love God, like not many people that I know, and are excited about their relationship with Him, and they serve others in very big, broad ways. So I know that's there, and I have experienced it to a certain degree. But I think what it comes down to for me is that the miracles, the spiritual gifts, these things seem to me like they should be more of a fringe thing in Peugeotian terms, something kind of on the edge. And rather, they, in at least the movements I have been involved in, have been put in the center. And I think that's where it gets off balance. And I think the attraction to me to viewing these things through the lens of the Orthodox Church in particular has been that everything has its proper place. And the emphasis is not on the miracle itself, but it's on the transformation that occurs through it. And it's not emphasized as being the most important thing or proof of your Christianity, or your walk with God.
I think that's very on point, and that aligns very much with what St. Paul actually says in Corinthians.
So I've, part of what's been rolling around in my head in anticipation of this was I just had that conversation with J.P. Marceau and John Vervaeke about C.S. Lewis's Miracle, his book Miracles. And part of what I appreciate about that book, and what I sort of, I think I shocked both John and JP when he asked about the placebo effect, if I thought that was miraculous. And I said yes, because I think, again, the placing it at the center within the modernist frame is I think an attempt to somehow deny the modernist frame while at the same time sort of giving into it by where you've placed it. Whereas, at least in Lewis's formulation, if you look at his chapter, The Grand Miracle in that book, Lewis in that book is sort of interesting because rationality itself is sort of analogous to the miraculous because it's a divine gift. At the center of human history, Lewis says, is the incarnation, the humiliation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension. That's the grand miracle. And Lewis basically says that grand miracle is the missing chapter. It's the key insight that makes sense of everything else around it. And I think, from what I hear from some of your stories, the then this morning I was thinking too about, okay, well, what's the biblical language about that? You don't, again, working with English language in the Bible is always difficult because obviously it wasn't written in English. You have signs and wonders. You have various terms in the Bible that we sort of translate into the miraculous, but the category itself in how we're dealing with it, and I really felt that in talking to J.P. Marceau and John Vervaeke, and then some of the pushback I actually got from a fair number of Christians after that conversation was, okay, there's just kind of a wholesale collapse into this categorization as miraculous. And I think we see some of that being played out in these movements, whereas, as I said before, Jonathan Peugeot in a conversation just, chucked up, as he often does, throws out here's the story of such and such saint. And it's, of course, that sends me to Google and the internet and the Wikipedia to find what random Eastern saint are you talking about now, and what are the events that surround that person. And in almost every case, and this is consistent with, say, the Roman Catholic tradition, something has happened around this person's life that is extraordinary. But I think, as many of you said, if you study the miracles of Jesus carefully, they are never merely demonstrations of authority, or they're never merely demonstrations of authority. And so when, for example, some of Jesus' rivals will come to him, and some of his enemies, in fact, will come to him and demand that he do miracles. And he keeps saying things like, a wicked and perverse generation asks for miracles, and I'm going to give them the sign of Jonah. And of course, suddenly, well, that threw them all into the symbolic realm. And when you look at others of Jesus' miracles, the water to wine, the feeding of the 5,000, the Jesus' miracles are always, they're in a sense, and this sounds dismissive, but I don't mean it as such. They're in a sense performance art. In other words, the miracles are symbolic manifestations of a revelation of what Jesus is pointing to. So the water to wine is is basically a symbolic manifestation of the life of the age to come. Same with the feeding of the 5,000. And when I look at how the seeking after miracles is appropriated in a modernist frame, I think that gets deeply problematic. But because of the emphasis on the symbolic of some of these ancient traditions, I would imagine they better understand exactly what and why Jesus was doing with the miracles we see in the canonical record. So I don't know what the three of you think of that, but that's just off the top of my head.
Well, I'll go. Yeah, I had hinted at this earlier, Paul, but I agree. I I don't think a good reading of the Gospels is to read that Jesus healed them all and go, oh, well, that means we need to do that too. Or Jesus' commands to his apostles, telling them, go heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons. I don't think the highest reading of that is clearly he just wants all believers to do that, which is more gets to my adulthood experience with the school I went to and all that. But I'm not saying that there's none of that involved either, because I was reading through some of the comments. Like, I don't think that the charismatic movement was an accident. I don't think that it has nothing to say. Like I said, I don't think it's all BS. Again, most of what I have experienced with close friends and family members, I don't think hardly any of it is BS. And so it's just it was just more, I went to the bottom and I found the bottom. Like Nate had said, I gave it, me personally, I gave it all I had, and it wasn't infused with meaning. It took that phrase, for instance, and maybe someone will be able to translate kind of what I'm saying here, of Jesus saying to the apostles, go do all this stuff. And then it says, boom, this is what Jesus wants every single individual in the church to do, which I just don't think is a proper understanding. It's a proper hierarchical understanding, because Paul never instructs anyone in his letters to the churches to do that. He's not like, hey, make sure you guys are out, like, sharing with your neighbors and praying for them. And, if they have a bad knee or a headache, like, make sure you pray for them. But at the same time, I'm not saying that certain movements or certain Christians can't do that, or it's all BS. So yeah, to tie in both with what you were saying, Paul, with Jesus's miracles being performance art, being an icon to something higher, I agree. And also, to answer some of the comments that were maybe concerned it was too critical, I would say part of that is just the experience of the panelists, and our personalities, being kind of on the deep thinker route. But I think what's good is that none of us are just like, yeah, it's all crap, like it's all a joke. So yeah, that's what I would say.
In terms of it not being all crap, I have a very personal, like, family connection to that. Like, that my mother's grandmother was rendered blind from smallpox epidemic in Oklahoma. This was like right around the time of some of the early Pentecostal revivals in Oklahoma. And her whole family got sick, and she prayed over her family, and they all recovered, but she lost her sight. And she was diagnosed as having a severely damaged optic nerve, and was told that she would never recover her sight. 9 months later, she heard the voice of God telling her, or, why haven't you asked for your eyesight back? And she answered back to God that you'd already given me so much by healing my family. I never thought to ask. And then she heard the voice of God telling her, well, why don't you ask? And she did, and she regained her sight instantly on the spot. And my own mother, like, definitely, like, has some sort of gift of prophecy. There are things that she knows that she just should not know. So I would definitely not deny the reality of all this kind of thing. I mean, it's very real, for sure, and I wouldn't want to deny it, but I have questions about it.
Yeah, and that's again one of my goals, maybe not even with this discussion, but kind of in my life, is to get I think, like Dave W has said, like, the Pentecostals have the fire, but the more traditional Christians have the fireplace. It's to get, like I said at the beginning, to get people outside of it to pay attention to it, because it's trying to tell the rest of the church something. It's trying to tell you, like, hey, just so you know, like, I know you live in a disenchanted world. That's not the real world. And so, like Sarah alluded to earlier, I have no problem understanding Pajot at all. Like, I can't explain it, but the whole spiritual natural dynamic in a way that's not Gnostic, I get it. Like, it makes complete sense to me, because I grew up in a world where this was just the real world. Like, you can't explain it. Angels, you can't see them. They're not material, but they're there. They're real. So it's no problem to me. But that's one of, to harken back to what Nate says, is to get people outside of it to pay attention to. It's like, man, find someone in there, listen to their story, listen to some crazy miracle that doesn't fit your paradigms, and go, huh, like, I guess I should create a space for that in my own journey, in my own walk, in my own church, for that possibility to even happen. Again, do I think that that's sort of within the charismatic movement at present, mass produced and advertised and taken advantage of? For sure. But my goal would be that, like that story Nate shared, that we would be open to hearing stories like that and to revivifying the stories that happen all the time in the New Testament in our churches. And so that, those are the elements that I'm absolutely taking with me as I head down new paths in my own denominational walk.
I think too, a lot of times in that pursuit of doing what Christ did and performing miracles, etc., they want to imitate those things, but then forget about the suffering. And I think that's where understanding the sacrament of healing, especially in particular talking about physical healing and even spiritual healing, has been so impactful on my understanding of this, is because the idea that you can take your illness and join it with Christ, and whether that ends up manifesting as a miracle or as suffering, it doesn't matter. It's still manifesting Christ. And that's a very freeing thing, because then you can just hold whatever you're dealing with open hands and know that you're still defeating the devil. He's not winning just because you haven't been, quote, healed in the way that we think of it.
And your point, Sarah, I think is really vital, because if you read the New Testament, the questions are, for me, okay, what were those miracles for? Every single person that Jesus healed went on to die. Lazarus, who Jesus called from the tomb, went on to die. The main act of redemption of Christ surrounds, if you read Philippians 2, his humiliation, his suffering, his death, his resurrection. And and that's, to me, that's just, Paul, the Apostle Paul, goes here and basically says, I've done, sort of brags to the other people of the church, I've done way more miracles, I've had far better visions, none of you can hold a candle to me, but what do I boast in? I boast in Christ crucified, which seems, if there's ever a moment you want a miracle, it's when your life is threatened, things that you value are threatened, and you go to God and say, come on, I thought that my moral status, I thought that my devotion, I thought that my obedience would give me status with you. Why can't I cash in that status for a degree of privilege right now that gives me a get out of suffering free card? One of the most interesting things I know with friends of mine who have pretty dramatic charismatic gifts is that most of them also have pretty dramatic disabilities, either in their own life or in their family or the circle of friends around them. And I have one friend who's got a really pretty dramatic gift of insight and healing in working with people with a lot of brokenness in their past, and God has done some pretty amazing things through him. And he's got a son who's got a disability, and he shared with me once that his wife, asked him, "You've prayed for these other people, and God has used you to heal them. Why won't he heal our son?" And when I look at the story of the gospel, we find the Son of God on a cross. And so, to me, when I look at these questions, that always comes to the forefront.
Yeah, I'm glad Sarah brought up the suffering bit, um, because within the topic of miracles, if it's put in its proper place, I don't think there's a contradiction here. But within the charismatic movement as a whole, it's something that has to be dealt with on a larger scale. Now, I will say there are plenty of people within the charismatic world who have a good, robust understanding of suffering and of the gospel and of how miracles fit into the whole story. So it's there. Like I'm not on the outside like, man, they got a lot to figure out. It's like the answers they need are in there with certain leaders and figures they have. But that was another thing for me too. Just in my own story was where suffering fits in, because again, towards my last few years there, I felt like I was sitting at the edge of the pool of Bethesda, waiting for the angel to stir the water. All my problems, any difficulty I faced, any suffering that anything that I was suffering from, automatically had this space in my framework and my ideology of, well, if God just blanks, then this will go away. And so it becomes really murky and really confusing, which I think the confusion part is a thing that a lot of people who become disillusioned with that specific brand of Christianity, the charismatic world, a lot of them come out confused from more dysfunctional from more dysfunctional churches, because it gets confusing, because it's like, well, God could just blank, why doesn't he? Or God healed that person, why doesn't he heal me? Or I can't discern between what is the ring that I wish had never come to me, that I need to bear, my cross to bear, or what is something that I just need to pray for and receive God's healing for, which is part of life. I mean, on a different, with different wording, I think that's just a common challenge a lot of us face is, okay, what do I need to press into and what do I need to let go of? But that was a big thing for me is, okay, I need to have a more robust understanding of suffering and take a break from, if I only blank or if God only blanks, then this will go away, and just be like, okay, this is what's going on. I need to deal with it. Yeah. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of my journey with that. I don't know if Nate or Sarah, you guys could speak more to the, maybe some of the, like, how things can be confusing, when you come out of it. Specifically, there's like spiritual manipulation involved, which again, I'm not saying is all of the charismatic world. I'm just saying the specific thing of spiritual manipulation can be really heightened in bad forms of that type of Christianity.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And there's there becomes a line there's a lot of confusion. Like, I mean, I know that, like, theologically, like, any charismatic will tell you that it's God's power operating, but that's not, by the way they behave, it doesn't necessarily seem like that's the presentation of it. Like, they're definitely presenting themselves as special when they do those things. And I will also say that the problematic relationship with suffering is probably at the root of why I struggled with theodicy as such a big issue at such an early age. I don't know if it's normal for 12-year-olds to obsess over theodicy, but it certainly was a big deal for me. And my church's inadequate understanding of suffering was certainly a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if because I never really latched onto that idea of um like waiting for God to do this or that, and why doesn't he? I don't know, that's something I never really wrestled with, but I've seen people around me wrestle with it. For example, my my sister had a niece that, as a 1-year-old, ended up getting into some toxic medication and became brain dead and was just a vegetable for over a year until finally she passed away. And my grandfather took it upon himself to, in a sense, get himself so right with God that he would be able to bring her back. And the damage that I see coming through that sort of perspective, and the hurt that surrounded all of that, because then people around him would think, well, maybe it's, it's my sin. Like, whose sin is it that's holding this up, and who's to blame here? And that's where it goes.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
tendency toward a lack of understanding of grace and to treat God like a vending machine and the negative
Mhm.
traditions.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Nick, you're just about every time you've told your story this morning, if you could, and I know you probably won't be able to, but if you could try to tell us what it is you're looking for, because at each point you tell us, I'm, you know, and of course YouTube, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, but tell me if you can put into words what it is you think you want.
Well, I think what I want is a story that makes sense at every level of reality, that scales all the way up and all the way down, like Pajot talks about. That's what I personally want. That's what I'm personally after. But what I want out of this conversation or talking about charismatic Christianity, I kind of laid that out earlier. So is that what you're getting at, Paul?
Yeah, well, and I think this, Sarah's story about her grandfather, that's, wow, that's so powerful. And the mantra of, and of course this is, the prayers, the book of James, the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. And, many of you, have fallen ill, that both gets connected to the sacrament and it gets connected to sin. And the idea that, well, God won't hear our prayers because we are full of sin. I mean, all of that gets built up. And, in the little bit of Charles Taylor that I read a few days ago, once you sort of establish an ultimate good, which in many circles can be hell avoidance, very quickly you also begin to scale up some definitive thing that can achieve that. And it's like these hierarchies naturally form around things. And so in the case of Sarah's, grandfather, quite understandably, it's one thing to lose a child or a grandchild because of, a virus that seems random, but it's another thing, something which seems to could have been easily prevented. And then, well, maybe if I can free myself from sin enough, I can secure this. But of course you bump right into the story of Jesus then, where you have the most perfect man who is dying the most humiliating death. And so, when you talk about a story that scales, yeah, I can see that. But my guess is not only just a story as such out there from you, but you want a story that you can live within and participate within towards some meaningful, productive outcome, I would imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, a lot of what I'm looking for is in, I mean, I'm finding in traditional Christianity. I don't want to talk too much about that right now, just because I'm on a journey with that. And I don't want to, I still feel like I'm wandering the Christian desert. So I don't want to say, oh, I'm going to end up here, or I'm going to end up there. But yeah, you're right. I'm looking for something to participate in where things are in their proper place. And there's something in charismatic Christianity that needs to be brought in to the story that I think is that I just kept noticing getting referenced by Holland, by you, by Pajot, by all these people. And I'm like, man, there's definitely a place for this, because the modern story, dives into the meaning and kind of forgets that it actually happened. That's why Lewis and I've even heard Pajot talk about it. They're like, to someone who really understands world religions and pagan myth, and calls Christianity just, oh man, it's kind of just an amalgamation of all of that, or it kind of puts it all together. Yeah, it's true. That's true, but it's also literally true. So it's like, oh, there's all this symbolic meaning behind Jesus healing the blind man or feeding 5,000. It's like, yeah, that's true, but it also happened. And so I think those are the two things I'm trying to put together. That there's something in the charismatic world that has the stuff that happens, but they kind of don't understand the meaning behind it. I felt that a lot of the people I was with, even though the stuff was happening, they were as I think I was talking with Joe earlier, they retroactively interpreted it through their framework, which was false. And there's other Christians and traditions who have the right framework, but don't have the fire, if you will. So I think that's what I'm looking for, is for the fire to be in the fireplace, and to be in its proper place on the hierarchy, and to find a story where things line up and make sense that I can participate in, that goes all the way back through church history. Because another one of the things this could have got brought up too is the story charismatic Christianity tells, by and large, that I heard, and not everyone would agree with this, but by and large, is, man, look at the early church, they got it right. Then they started to get it wrong, and then they really got it wrong. The Catholics got it wrong, except for the canonization. That was the Holy Spirit and some saints. And then Martin Luther kind of got some stuff right. And then the First Great Awakening happening, and the Holy Spirit was back. And ever since then, we've slowly been getting back to how the first century church was. That story is not a good story. And I think because I kind of take things to their logical conclusion, like right away, just because of my intuitive mind, I realized things just didn't add up. Like, that's not a good story. And it's kind of a Protestant problem too, that it has to answer. And so, yeah, that's kind of just where I'm at with everything.
Yeah, I'm kind of almost exactly where you are entirely. That's really well said, Nick.
Sarah, you, I get the sense more from Nick and Nate that they don't feel like they've settled anywhere yet. They're still sort of roaming around, but you've at least lately settled more again into orthodoxy, and of course on this server and in any place downstream from Pajot, and Peterson to a degree. That's a pretty common thing. What can you share with us a little bit about what you found in orthodoxy that has at least led to some resolution of some elements of your story that you've already shared?
Sure. Can you hear me? I switched microphones.
Yeah, you sound fine.
Okay. I think understanding the biblical patterns through Peugeot's analysis, and then seeing how those patterns are not arbitrary and keep popping up throughout the Bible, throughout church history, throughout the lives of the saints, the writings of the church fathers, and then being able to find my place in that story. I mean, a smaller pattern that scales has been probably the most impactful thing for me. And it's a very a very symbolic pattern, even down to some of the I was talking to some people the other day about names, and even down to some of the names of my family members and how this story has kind of played out has tied into the whole thing. Like, I'll just briefly tell kind of one of the most impactful things that happened to me a couple of years ago as I started to explore all of this, and that I moved from Texas to North Dakota. I came from the city, moved to the farm. And in a sense, it was like moving to a foreign land. And so have always felt like an outsider, considering myself to be, I'm always interested in things that aren't the norm, thinking of things outside the box, and not feeling like that was necessarily a bad thing, but trying to figure out how that integrates. So, feeling that way normally, plus moving to a foreign land and trying to integrate myself into this was a challenge, and felt very isolated for a long time. But as I started to dig into this stuff and realize these deeply embedded patterns, the thing that kept popping back up to me time and time again was how often the foreigner, the outsider, the person on the edge is used to come back and revitalize or turn the culture, turn the family back to Christ. And my name is Sarah, which means princess, or heir, royalty, and I have felt like anything but that. But I very clearly one time heard, I mean, I don't know how to say it. I heard God's voice tell me that I was to be the uniter of family, my family. And it was hard for me to even believe it. Like, I just put it out of my mind. But at one point I was really struggling with all of this, and my father-in-law's mother had passed away. And I'd been convicted about being bitter and looking at the thing that was wrong rather than being grateful, and to the point of tears. And so I decided that I was going to spend some time walking around my yard with my bare feet, just to try and connect myself, because I knew that's what I did as a child, very connected to nature, very connected to the world and the earth, and felt God through that. So I just determined to do that, and to connect with the people that had come before me, that had lived on this farm for generations. And through my father-in-law's mother dying, it opened up some conversations about what had happened surrounding their family. And his situation was very abusive. And so even the house we lived in, there were times where he would hide his younger siblings in the bedroom to keep them from his raging alcoholic father. Things like that were devastating. And generations of kind of abuse in that way. Well, my father-in-law had really sacrificed himself to keep his family intact and bring them back to Christ, to stop those negative abusive patterns. And so one day, as I was hearing these stories and trying to connect, I was walking around the backyard, and I was just hit all of a sudden, and another almost audible voice that said, "You are the outsider." And because of my study and immersion in those patterns, all of a sudden it struck me as not a negative thing, as not a bad thing, but as the very role that I had been set, that had been spoken to me that I would be able to play. And I've never felt knocked to the ground before, but I did. And there's a spot out in our backyard right now that's like a sacred space. It's my, I almost want to put a tower of rocks there or something, to my Bethel, and I can go back there and I can remember myself. I can rejoin myself with that spot when I go and take off my shoes and stand there. And since that moment, so many things I could go on and on about, just little things here and there that have happened that have led to confirm that. But it's just given me such a peace about what my role is, how it can be effective and impactful, and feel like I'm part of this bigger picture that is emphasized throughout everything that I hold dear. The history of the church, the Bible, my family, and on and on.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very powerful, and I think you, in some ways, really did draw, at least for me, the connection between what we might call the miraculous and the symbolic, and also meaning. Because in that, let's use a Pentecostal term, in that word from the Lord, you found you found the meaning within the symbolism. You found both the big story or a bigger story, and your role within that story. And there are a few more meaningful things that we can experience than something like that. So thanks for sharing that with us. Well,
So
go ahead.
I was going to say, we're about 15 minutes to when we were going to open up to the rest of the community to add or ask questions. Were there any last things that any of the panelists want to say before we do that? If not, we can open it up now.
Or maybe some takeaways from the panelists from this conversation. Is there anything that you've sort of realized or learned? What are some of your takeaways from this hour or so that we've spent together?
I would say it's pretty clear that none of us want to throw it out entirely, and that we realize that there's something there within the charismatic movement that deserves being engaged with some level of seriousness.
Nick, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Nate. And one of my other takeaways from hearing your guys' stories, just how much because part of what the charismatic movement is in the West specifically is it's a house for people's stories that don't fit the modern framework. Because as Paul, you've talked about, you once shared with me, there was a member in your church who had this experience with God or this presence where she had this immense peace, but she felt like she couldn't tell her family. In large part, the charismatic church functions as a place for like, oh yeah, like I've heard that story. I've heard a story of that caliber before. Like Sarah, your story, both of the blindness getting healed and then the story you just shared. It's like, I've heard probably over 1,000 stories of that caliber. Like it's what happens in life. And so that's one more thing to mention that the charismatic church serves as right now. It's like, you can't go to a mainline, and even a lot of non-charismatic churches, regardless of the denomination, share a story like that. And they'd be like, okay. I think that's changing a bit, but yeah, that would be one of my takeaways. And then another takeaway is that, to add to what Nate said of none of us want to throw it out. Also, we're all looking to incorporate things that we learn from it into something we view as larger and more robust, which again I feel encouraged by this. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I'll
Awesome.
just add one last thing too. I think that, you're asking about what in the traditional or Orthodox landscape has helped me bring it back. And I think it hasn't, I say you need a fireplace for the fire, but it's broadened the ways to me, for me to be able to connect in a quote supernatural way. I think specifically about icons. I was struggling for a while with having horrific dreams about my children being ripped apart in front of me and just terrible, terrible stuff like that. Struggling with a lot of fear about what was going to happen to my kids. And I had a dream after a series of recurring dreams where I had been, well, before that, I had been really studying different icons and specifically the Dormition of Mary. And it's a picture of Christ holding Mary's soul, and everyone looks peaceful, but she's obviously, her body is dead, but she's with Christ. And so then I ended up having a dream later where again my daughter was being ripped apart in front of me by a sea monster. Some symbolism happens, and as she was being torn apart, it was almost like time slowed down, and then I saw this icon in my dream, and the face of Mary transformed into the face of my daughter. And that picture, I can go back and look at that now, and that just that feeling of Christ holding us no matter what happens comes back to me. So I mean, and again, more things like that have happened. So that's one thing I've really appreciated. It's gotten bigger. My view of all this has gotten bigger rather than smaller.
Awesome. Paul, do you have any takeaways?
Yeah, for me, this was really helpful in terms of connecting. Because again, I said this morning, I was thinking about this conversation and thinking about C.S. Lewis's book and thinking about my conversation with John Vervaeke and JP, and also some of my past conversations with Jonathan Peugeot. And this conversation has really helped me connect the miraculous and the symbolic, and especially then also add the element of meaning and a story we can live within, but also a story that we participate in. So I found this super helpful, because I do think that after my conversation with JP and with John Vervaeke, I've been thinking. I didn't touch on it much in my videos this week, but it's definitely something rolling around in my head in terms of as we emerge from modernity, hopefully continuing to bear its gifts, we're going to need to reintegrate these fringe elements. And again, I think the Peugeotian hierarchical landscape that he has blessed us with is super helpful. I was, the videos I did this week, I was thinking about Alex Jones and Kanye West, and how, probably partly because of my weird spiritual gift of attracting the chaotic, but every church that I've been in, every healthy church that I've been in has had, I look at people like Kanye and Alex Jones, they're there in the churches. And so when I look at them, yeah, they're unusual and I find it hilarious and enjoying and entertaining, but I also, these are people in my neighborhood. And so this conversation has sort of helped me continue to try to reintegrate what our culture has suppressed, because Nick is exactly right. As a pastor, people will tell me stories, and once they get a sense how open I am and they feel safe with me, they'll trust me with their stories that they won't dare tell other people in church, just because of the sort of pervasive bias of modernity. It's kind of like people not admitting that they voted for Trump. It's people not admitting real experiences in their life. And I've been a mocker in some of that too, especially with my own family, and I have to repent of that. But this is real stuff. And so I found this conversation enormously interesting and extremely helpful.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah, well, thank you everybody for participating. Now, for anybody else who's listening in who has a question or a comment about what's spoken, I think now's the time to kind of engage if you're interested.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So when it seems like with Pentecostalism, so do you, and this is a sort of a question I want to hear from Nick and Nate, and then from Sarah from the Orthodox perspective, because it seemed like the difference that I can kind of see is that in wanting to push back against modernity, Pentecostalism seems like it can overcorrect and sort of blind itself to the fractal nature of reality, and then you lose the ability to find your piece of the larger pattern that you can live within. And that's what, when Nick was talking about that kind of, and then when comparing that to Sarah's experience with how she was sort of able to find her role in the story, compared to Nick sort of struggling with that. So I just wanted to hear you guys comment on that.
Well, first of all, I didn't want to give, I might have given a slightly wrong impression. Like, in terms of, like, I mean, the only reason I'm not Orthodox is that I live in an area where there just aren't any Orthodox churches. So, like, my theological thinking is profoundly influenced by Orthodoxy, primarily Russian Orthodoxy. In terms of my current, like, church situation, my son is strongly moved toward becoming Anglican, and so my current inclination is to kind of follow him in that direction. So my framing is a little bit more orthodox than I may have given the impression, so that just that.
Nate, do you think that you've found that because you're sort of pulling back? Like, that's what I was kind of saying with, like, if you start with, like, the overcorrection, and then over time you've dialed it back and you're finding things in Orthodoxy that were missing from Pentecostalism.
Yeah, actually, so like I said, I mean, it's like the moment that I became an agnostic who thought there probably was a God was that experience I had on that field trip in that Russian Orthodox church. And then when I was at Thomas Aquinas College, I got answers to some of my questions, but I didn't necessarily always agree with the Catholic version of those answers. And even at that time, like even before I converted to Catholicism, I was much more aligned with Orthodoxy on almost every single important theological issue that divides the Western and Eastern churches. So, yes.
So this might tie into what you're asking, Tyler. One of the things that caught my attention my last few years where I was not fully disillusioned yet, me personally, was I would see, again, back to patterns. I would start to notice these things. So it's like, because I grew up charismatic, which is for the most part just as much Protestant as it is anything else. Although the Catholic Church has did a while ago officially sort of swallow it up and say, yeah, this is legit. Anyway, that's another time. But so in that very Protestant upbringing, it was like, oh man, those Catholics, like they just got it all wrong. Like, can you believe them with their old paintings and their relics and their veneration of the saints and all this? But what was very much a part of my being a student at Bethel was we would celebrate these revivalists, and I would go clean the offices of the pastors at Bethel, and they would have pictures up on the walls of these revivalists. And Bethel's starting a museum where they're going to have all these artifacts. It's like, well, that seems like relics. And it's even like you'd even go to a meeting at school and they'd be like, oh, everyone come sit in this chair that was Catherine Coleman's chair, and we're going to pray over you. I'm like, hold on a second. Like, this is the same pattern playing out. And so I found a better house for that pattern that was connected to the source in traditional Christianity. Whereas in the charismatic world because of the story it tells, which is that Holy Spirit was kind of absent and now he's been moving the last 200, 300 years. Now he's back, but there's no connection to the source. Well, there is, because I'm not saying it's all crap. I'm just saying I found a better, that it's more, that the traditional churches, when you bring in that fire, if you will, that I experienced into the fireplace of traditional Christianity, it fits better. It fits more properly. So I don't know if that quite, and no, it doesn't directly answer your question. I don't know if it even gets at it a little bit.
No, I think it does a little bit. It's like there's something deeper that you found, and sort of you had to go through the charismatic sort of, I guess, I don't know, phase or something like that, so that you can then, whereas I think a lot of people without that exposure, they see it and they kind of just, they scoff at it, right? They're so modern that it doesn't, but like in you kind of have to, you've seen it, you've seen too much. You can't just reject these things out of hand anymore. And so it causes you to it just makes you kind of stop and think. And then that opens up this space of possibility for the appreciation of these, deeper, older traditions.
Yeah. I guess my link between older traditions and charismatic Christianity is the things that I found, and the reason why I won't throw it out, that I found in charismatic Christianity, I found a better, more tried and true version of in traditional Christianity, but the patterns are there for me.
Nick, it's funny. I had a really nice conversation with my mother and my son a couple weekends ago when she was here visiting. And my mom actually said in the process of this conversation that if there was a Russian Orthodox church anywhere near her, and she's like 2 hours away from the nearest one, she would consider becoming Russian Orthodox.
I'm going to say this and probably upset some of you, but it amazes me how, because I've known people that have grown up in very liturgical traditions and they just want to get the heck out of there because it's just all mapped territory to them. And then there's others who are coming from far less liturgical traditions. My friend Warren Mills in Australia, I mean, he's been over the whole landscape, and now he's in the the most liturgical Anglican church he can find in Melbourne, and he loves it. He's been a charismatic, he's been a dispensational. I mean, he's been all over the place, and it's just fascinating to me watching. I would have to call it sort of the living, breathing heart of the church, which is, of course, the integration of humanity and the pattern of God, to put it in Pageauian terms. So this just fascinates me to no end.
Yeah, that's basically the thesis of Catherine Pickstock's after writing. Like, she sees that meaning is essentially liturgical.
I'll just add that I've found all of the elements that I appreciated within the charismatic movement to be all there. Like, I found everything. It just was more integrated and had a proper place. And that is very reassuring, because to me, the times when it caused the most damage was when it just became chaotic and out of control and stripped from an attachment to the history of the church. And I think with liturgy as well, I kind of think of liturgy, I'm a musician, and so I almost think of it as learning music theory, in that you have to have the structure in order to actually be free. You can't just sit down and bang on the piano and expect a beautiful song to be played. You have to learn the patterns. You have to learn the structure and how it works. And through that, then you're able to be free on the other side. And I think that's what I've seen in the liturgy and the patterns and the history, all of these things tied together.
have a question, and it's a little bit of a pivot from what we're talking about. But from my own personal experience, what I found is that my my skepticism in the charismatic movement sort of started waning away when I started hearing materialists talk about ghost stories or these supernatural experiences that they've had. And I had a similar experience to that first chapter in Miracles that Lewis talks about with a friend, and Nathan Jacob talks about with the nuns, this idea that they're spiritual but not religious. How do you think that sort of plays into the charismatic movement and how people see that from this modernist framework? Because it just baffles me sometimes that the modernists are the ones who are claiming these spiritual beings, where many Christians who were like me, who had been in charismatic movements, had spiritual experiences, or sometimes more skeptical of those things.
So, if you read modern history, part of what the Enlightenment does, and Tom Holland's thesis folds into this, is that the Protestant Reformation looks at many of the excesses that they see in the medieval Roman Catholic Church and just basically call BS on a bunch of it. And so this is the process of reform. Jesus says astounding things like, it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of your heart. And it's like, wow. That's it's just draw, how was this built into the tradition? But it was. And so then you get to the Enlightenment and you find Voltaire and many around him, Diderot, taking a stick at the, but first you have the framework of the supernatural through deism, and then you have them taking a stick to that. And modernity is just working this through. And so again, culturally, before you had the tyranny of the Roman Catholic institution, now you have the tyranny of the principality of modernity that sort of excludes all of these other things. And so what you have with Romanticism, with spiritualism at the end of the 19th century, is you have all of this stuff just squirting out the side. And again, I haven't found anyone who can sort of frame all of this for me in a better coherent picture than Peugeot, because his articulation of this sort of makes space for this. And now, understanding Peugeot better and better, I can understand Lewis better in terms of, okay, here's all these oddities. And that actually was sort of built into the movie trilogy, The Matrix, as well. And here's all these archaic programs that remain in the system, and they're still functioning in the system. And so it creates sort of this imaginary where all of this is held. And I think Peugeot is right that we're now where the train has left the station from modernity for now 100 years, and where more and more people are beginning to see some of this. And so modernist Christians and modernist skeptics are both going to be getting nervous about the amount of BS that's going to be relet into the systems, because Protestants basically said all these things that we can't explain, demons. Oh, okay. It's even the biblical text isn't that dogmatic with some of these things. So we just basically are getting a new lesson in the limitations of our models, and this is going to continue. I don't know if that answered your question at all, Cassidy.
I don't know if it did either. Yeah, it's just such an interesting phenomenon, because I work in industries with a lot of non-religious people, like atheists, agnostics, and a lot of people who have sort of an animosity to religion. and the amount of stories that I've heard about, these supernatural experiences that they have, like, it got me to the place where I started to question my own skepticism about some of those things. And I still have a bit of a skepticism with charismatic Christianity and some of the ways that plays out in a similar way that the panelists do. But it is interesting to me, some of those what I see as inconsistencies in these worldviews of, like, you think that all there is space, time, and matter, yet, like, you legitimately think you saw a ghost. I don't know. Just interesting.
Yeah, my experience with people both who have left Christianity and those who are in the New Age space, my daughter was telling me the TV show Supernatural. I mean, how many seasons are they into that show? There's this, and Clay Rutledge, who, Paul Anleitner keeps telling you got to get Clay Rutledge on your channel, because Clay Rutledge is a skeptic, and he just looks around and says the notion, and Vervaeke says the same thing, the notion that, Sam Harris's dream that somehow people are going to be rational and ghosts and aliens and astrology and Ouija boards, and that all of this is going away. Evidence, you're evidence-based people. Look at the evidence. It's not going away. It's, as Charles Taylor said, it's in supernova right now. And this isn't just people's ideas about, things that are categorized as supernatural. Look at what's happening in terms of the election. I mean, who's really stealing the election? Is it Trump or Biden? And, on we go. And so this is not disconnected from the meaning crisis. This is not disconnected from the crisis of sense making. It's all part of the same story.
Yeah, with what you're saying about someone who's an ardent modernist but describes ghost stories, my reaction, and again, it goes back to my comment that the charismatic church, part of what it is, it's a house for people who have stories that don't fit into the modern framework. It's, I just laugh. And even, Pajot has helped me more than anyone else. Like, combine, I like the terms you use, Paul, the symbolic and the miraculous, because I think it's what I was getting at earlier with the charismatic church has the miraculous. I'm not sure they understand the symbolism behind it. And then these more ancient traditions have the symbolism, but they're not exactly seeing their churches running over with all these supernatural experiences pointing to something beyond. But it's like, even Pajot, like, if he starts to describe it too much, I'm like, at some point, man, you've got to just, at some point, anyone who dives into it, kind of like how Tom Holland was describing his journey, where he's at with it. He's like, I don't know if they're true, but I'm jumping into the story and taking it for what it's worth. At some point, if you do that long enough, you just start talking about angels and demons and Bible stories as if they're true, and it doesn't matter. I mean, there's a reason that if we really do believe scriptures have been handed down to us and that God has something to do with them being put together, there's a reason he doesn't explain. And even the church fathers who explain stuff don't explain every single thing, because eventually you can explain it into oblivion. Like, at the end of the day, you come back around to saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that's a long explanation for the question, but to me, it's like, you can materially explain away your ghost stories however you want, but you don't explain away the pain that you feel after a breakup as just a chemical imbalance in your brain. You would describe it as if it's reality, even though materially speaking, it's not reality. So, yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think the biggest thing that I realized from some of those experiences, this sort of backwards thinking and perspective between my worldview and theirs, where they have this modernist framework that doesn't really give space for the supernatural, yet they have this belief in the supernatural and have experienced that. And I'm over here, this Christian who in a lot of ways has a space for the supernatural and a place for explaining that sort of thing, yet I don't really believe it. Like, and there's even that contradiction where it's like, but I've experienced some of those things, not in the way that they've explained it, like a ghost or a spirit or something, but I've had spiritual experiences, things that were outside of myself that I couldn't explain, yet I just saw this modernist wiring that was sort of weaved into the Christianity that I was brought up in and had exposure to, that was creating this weird dichotomy in the way that I thought about those things.
Well, and Peterson, we have this divided world, and what caught my attention about Peterson, even though I couldn't have articulated it really for quite a while, was he was trying to map the connection between these two worlds. And of course, all my working on Peterson eventually would lead me to, it was in an adult Sunday school class where the school spirit, I was wrestling with this question of, okay, what do we mean by this word? Because it's deeply problematic in the modern framing. You have modernists running all over the place using this word spiritual, and it's like, well, please tell me what you mean by that word, and they can't. Well, how can we use a word, and we can all use a word communally, and we don't know what we mean by it? And so that then led me into, and so sort of the school spirit was when I started thinking through that, and my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot about angels and watching myself respond, think through those things. I mean, it just began to open up new understandings of, some new mappings in terms of the integration of heaven and earth. And once you see those new mappings and you go back to scripture, it's like, oh, and that process continues for me.
It's funny when you're talking about this, saying these words and these modernist frameworks like spiritual and not having a meaning for that. Coming to that conclusion about that side of the spectrum of worldviews made me realize how prevalent that was in, religious communities where we say words and they have meanings and we think we know what they mean, but do we really know what they mean? And then it gets really hard. And I think especially with just my experience with charismatic traditions, there's a lot of like confidence in things that seem much more complicated and like saying words and having them repeated as like slang almost, and not feeling as if we really know what we're meaning by those words.
There's a deep, what we see in cargo cults and sort of dismissing it. We should not be looking at those people and saying, oh, look at those silly people with their cargo cult. That's the first thing we try. We started that as little children, and in some ways Pentecostal churches have for a long time been, we did this thing and this thing happened and we liked it, and so let's experiment and try and do it again. And so it's sort of the instinctive first movement towards the scientific method, but what we're dealing with are things that the scientific method is incapable of capturing. That's the best way I could say it.
May I interject something?
Yes, please go ahead.
So with the charismatic stuff, there's a part of me that thinks about this, and I think there's an element of this to where so much of what we call charismaticness and like fruits of the spirit and stuff and things like healings and prophecy and praying in tongues and miracles is just something that humans can do. Like I think of with Moses and his going up against the Egyptian priests, and Moses turns his his staff into a snake, and then the priests turn their staffs into snakes. And all of those guys can turn their staffs into snakes. And so whether they're with God or not with God. And so I wonder if what we're looking at with charismatic stuff is a side of Christianity that's exploring an aspect of the human experience that has been largely ignored in the modern world. And it's just like the Christian flavor of these spiritual experiences. Yeah.
I think you're really onto something there, because in a lot of ways, what it really comes down to is, are you going to have a first principle of power or a first principle of gift? That's ultimately what the choice is.
I think that's exactly right. And sort of what secular does is says, here's real life. Here's blue skies, open space, and the church is within walls. Well, once you make that move, religion S is compartmentalized. And once you make that move, Jesus is Lord only under the dome. He's not Lord of the blue sky. And so what we're trying to wrestle with is, okay, but why were Pharaoh's magicians able to turn their staffs into snakes? And why were they able to turn water into blood? But then when sort of the plagues level up, they reach the end of their power. And to me, that says, to me, so we're asking framing questions. What is the frame? What does the frame look like? What does reality look like? And the Bible is the Bible doesn't freak the heck. I mean, when Pharaoh's magicians turn their staffs into snakes, Moses and Aaron don't run to the mountain and suck their thumb. Why not? And when what's his name in the book of Acts, Simon Magnus, look him up on Wikipedia. There are traditions of Simon the magician who approaches Peter and says, hey, I look at the magic, the mojo that you guys are doing, and I'll give you money if you can share the spirit with me. That's sort of a pagan transactionalism within this frame. And Peter kind of looks at him like, yeah. and so this is where we're at now. And so modernity, quite rightly, took a stick to a lot of BS out there and sort of told the church, hey, you need to up your game on this stuff. And we're still in that process. These things take centuries. And so we've discovered in science that the universe is a lot weirder than we thought it was. And so we're working it out.
I have a question that's kind of always bothered me about the whole charismatic movement. How and this is to all the panelists and Paul. How do you think our Western consumerist mentality contributes to charismatic movements? Or does it even?
It's Simon Magnus. We want to wield it. We see this power, and here's the thing. We want to be Jesus without the cross.
That's nice.
Yeah, I think again it's worth referencing that I definitely don't think it comes after when consumerism really took off. It definitely comes before. Like, I think the first Great Awakening in America is something to point to, which there's been loads and loads and loads of books on America as it relates to this, because it was America plays into plays into this pretty heavily, but that's a whole other discussion, a whole other topic. And not to say it was only an American export, but I think part of the problem with, not the problem, but one of the things with the movement right now, because it is largely Western, is that, and then again, this relates to my experiences at Bethel in particular, kind of this belief that everyone wants a king like Jesus, and if we just show them all this stuff and really hone in on this stuff here at our church and then export it to the rest of the world, it's dominion theology. Like, we'll not take over the world and be powerful, but God's kingdom will take over the world, which I just think their timing's a little off. But where it plays into American consumerism is again, like, a lot of times, like, what's popular can become it can turn into a marketing model. But I don't think that's relegated to the charismatic church in particular.
No.
I think
Okay.
that's something evangelicalism.
I guess I'm probably not articulating that well enough, but like I'm thinking about prosperity gospel, but not only prosperity gospel in the modern sense, but I think that the Protestant work ethic is a kind of a prosperity gospel. What are your thoughts?
I think that our market economies kind of came out of the Protestant doctrine of total depravity. I think that's probably right.
Again, go all the way back to the Garden of Eden story. In a sense, Adam and Eve say to God, "We want your stuff. We don't want you."
Right.
We're still playing that out.
Yeah. Okay, good point, Paul. Thank you.
All right, so we're getting close to the end of our scheduled time. Is there any last pressing questions or comments?
Yeah, does it have to end?
The conversation? No. We're probably going to stop the recording, but obviously it doesn't ever end here on the Discord, so.
Perfect.
We'll stop the live stream. So if anybody out there in live stream land want to come on in and continue the conversation, I think Rick dropped an invite to the room into the live stream, and they can come in.
I just want to add real quick. I think someone brought this up, and I think for me, the emphasis on all of these things being a gift is crucial to this conversation. Even the difference in how I see the Eucharist and communion presented in my background versus how I've come to value it now. We always took communion before. At least in the Orthodox tradition and Catholicism, I'm sure it's received. And again, I don't deny any of these things are possible. But I think rather than, like Sherry was saying, trying to summon them or making it into a transactional system versus working on yourself, becoming the most fertile soil, becoming the most open and perceptive person you can be in order to be able to receive these gifts is what it comes down to.
And we really hate that. We really don't trust that God is good and will give good gifts to his children. We really don't want to live in that space.
Amen.
Why don't we trust?
Oh, that's a great question. Why don't we trust? You've got Adam and Eve in a perfect garden, and they can't trust. And so they listen to the serpent, and they take the fruit, and they hide. And who told you you were naked? That's our story.
Paul, you always make it sound good.
Well, maybe that's a good place for us to land the plane.
I was just going to say that. So thanks for everybody tuning in live or tuning in after. Thanks to all of our panelists and everybody who participated. This has been another episode of Randomizing Randos. We'll see where it goes from here, but thanks for participating in this.